Thank you for joining us around the fire. Now, want to hear a scary story?
The Allisons' summer cottage, 7 miles from the nearest town, was set prettily on a hill. From 3 sides it looked down on soft trees and grass that seldom lay still and dry. On the 4th side was the lake, which touched against the wooden pier the Allisons had to keep repairing, and which looked equally well from the Allisons' front porch, their side porch, or any spot on the wooden staircase leading from the porch down to the water. Although the Allisons looked forward to arriving in the early summer and hated to leave in the fall, they had not troubled themselves with any improvements. The cottage had no heat, no running water except for a backyard pump, and no electricity. For 17 summers, Janet Allison had cooked on a kerosene stove, heating all of their water. Robert Allison had brought buckets full of water daily from the pump and read his papers by kerosene light in the evenings. And they had both become indifferent about the outhouse. In themselves, the Allisons were ordinary people. Mrs. Allison was 58 years old and Mr. Allison 60. They had seen their children outgrow the summer cottage and go on to families of their own and seashore resorts. Their friends were either dead or settled in comfortable year-round houses. In the winter, they told one another that they could stand their New York apartment while waiting for the summer. In the summer, they told one another that the winter was worthwhile waiting to get to the country. The Allisons invariably left the cottage on Tuesday after Labor Day, and were as invariably sorry when the months of September and early October turned out to be pleasant. Each year they recognized that there was nothing to bring them back to New York. But it was not until this year that they overcame their traditional tendencies to decide that they would stay at the cottage after Labor Day. Consequently, with much pleasure and a slight feeling of adventure, Mrs. Allison went into the village the day after Labor Day and told the locals that she and her husband had decided to stay at least a month longer at their cottage. "Nobody ever stayed at the lake past Labor Day before," said Mr. Babcock, the grocer. He stopped putting away Mrs. Allison's groceries for a minute to look reflectively into a bag of cookies. "Nobody," he added. "But the city, you really have no idea." Mrs. Allison always spoke of the city to Mr. Babcock as though it were his life's dream to go there. "It's so hot. We're always sorry when we leave." "Hate to leave," Mr. Babcock said. "But I never heard of anyone ever staying out on the lake after Labor Day before." "Well, we're going to give it a try," Mrs. Allison said, and Mr. Babcock replied gravely, "Never know till you try." Since this was their big trip into town, which they made only once every 2 weeks to buy things that they could not have delivered, they spent all day at it, stopping for a sandwich at the soda shop and heaping their purchases into the back of the car. Mrs. Allison was tempted by the set of glass baking dishes that had found themselves in the general store and which had seemingly been waiting there for her, since the native people had only recently begun to experiment with aluminum dishes instead of ironware. Mrs. Allison had the dishes carefully wrapped to endure the rocky ride home, and while Mr. Walpole, who ran the store with his brother, unfolded the newspapers to wrap around the dishes, Mrs. Allison said, "I'm sure I could have waited and gotten these in New York, but we're not going back so soon this year." "Heard you were staying on," Mr. Walpole said. His old fingers fumbled maddeningly with the thin paper, carefully trying to isolate only one sheet at a time, and he did not look up as he went on. "Don't know about staying up there at the lake. Not after Labor Day." "Well, you know," Mrs. Allison said, just seemed to us that we've been hurrying back every year, and there just wasn't any need for it. You know what the city's like in the fall." She smiled confidingly up at him. Rhythmically, he wound string around the package. "It's giving me a piece long enough to save," Mrs. Allison thought. She looked away quickly to avoid giving any sign of impatience. "I feel like we belong here more," she said. To prove this, she smiled across the store at a woman with a familiar face, who might have been the lady who sold berries, or the one who occasionally helped in the grocery. Probably Babcock's aunt. "Well," Mr. Walpole said, "never been summer people before at the lake after Labor Day." He shoved the package across the counter. Mrs. Allison gave him a $5 bill, and he made change, and with a nod, went across to the store to help two women with the dresses. "They're great people," Mrs. Allison told her husband as they went together down the sidewalk after meeting outside. "They're so solid, so reasonable, so honest." "Makes you feel good, knowing that there are still towns like this," Mr. Allison said. "You know, in New York," Mrs. Allison said, "I might have paid less for these dishes, but there wouldn't have been anything sort of personal in the transaction." "I guess Labor Day is when they usually leave," Mr. Hall, the Allisons' nearest neighbor, told them later in front of Mr. Babcock's store, where the Allisons were getting into their car to go home. "Surprised you're staying on." "It seemed a shame to go so soon," Mrs. Allison said. The Halls lived 3 miles away. They supplied the Allison with butter and eggs, and from the top of the hill, the Allisons could see the glow of lights in their windows when they went to bed. "I don't guess anyone's ever stayed out there so long before," Mr. Hall said. "Not after Labor Day, anyway." The ride home was long and rough. It was beginning to get dark, and Mr. Allison had to drive very carefully over the dirt road by the lake. Mrs. Allison lay back against the seat. The new baking dishes lurked agreeably in her mind, and the half-bushel of red apples, and the package of colored thumbtacks with which she was going to put up a new shelf edging in the kitchen. "Good to get home," she said softly as they came in sight of their cottage. "Glad we decided to stay on," Mr. Allison agreed. Mrs. Allison spent the next morning lovingly washing her baking dishes, although Mr. Walpole had neglected to notice the chip in the edge of one. She decided to use some of the apples in a pie, and while the pie was in the oven and Mr. Allison was down getting the mail, she sat out on the little lawn and watched the changing lights on the lake. It always irritated Mr. Allison to walk the mile to the mailbox on the state road and come back with nothing. This morning, there was nothing but a circular from the department store and their New York paper, which arrived erratically 1 to 4 days later than it should, so that some days the Allisons might have 3 papers and other days none. Mrs. Allison, although she shared the annoyance of not having mail when they anticipated it, pored affectionately over the department store circular and made a mental note to drop in at the store when she finally went back to New York and check on the sales of wool blankets. It was hard to find good ones and pretty colors nowadays. She debated having the circular to remind herself, but after thinking about getting up to put it away somewhere, she dropped it in the grass and lay back, her eyes half closed. "Looks like we might get some rain," Mr. Allison said, squinting at the sky. "Good for the crops," Mrs. Allison said, and they both laughed. The kerosene man came the next morning while Mr. Allison was down getting the mail, and Mrs. Allison greeted the man warmly. During the summer, he hauled their garbage away for them. A garbage man was only necessary for city folk, as country people had no garbage. "I'm glad to see you," Mrs. Allison told him. "We're getting low." The kerosene man, whose name she had never learned, stared uncomfortably at Mrs. Allison, his truck motor still going. "Thought you folks be leaving," he said. "We're staying on another month or so," Mrs. Allison said brightly. "It seemed like—" "That's what they told me," the man said. "Can't give you no oil, though, after Labor Day," the man said. Mrs. Allison reminded herself that city manners were no good with these people, so she smiled and said, "But can't you get extra oil, at least while we stay?"
"Oh, I order from maybe 50 miles away. I order back in June. How much I'll need for the summer? Round about now, it's starting to get pretty short,"
man said. As though the subject were closed, he tightened his hands to the wheel in preparation for departure. "But you can't give us some?" Mrs. Allison said. "Isn't there anyone else that you can order from?"
"Don't know anywhere else right now,"
the man said, consideringly.
"I can't give you none."
Before Mrs. Allison could speak, the truck began to move. She ran a few steps to catch up, calling, "Will you try to get us some next week?" The truck drove away, and Mrs. Allison watched it go with anger. Just let him try coming around next summer, she told herself. There was no mail again, only the paper, and Mr. Allison was openly cross when he returned. When Mrs. Allison told him about the kerosene man, he was not particularly impressed. "Probably keeping it all for a high price during the winter," he commented.
"What's happened to Ann and Jerry, do you think?"
Ann and Jerry were their son and daughter, both married, one in Chicago, one in the West, and their weekly letters were late.
"Thoughtless, selfish children," he said. "Ought to realize how we wait for those letters."
"Well, dear," Mrs. Allison said, "wishing won't bring the mail. I'm going to call Mr. Babcock and tell him to send up some kerosene."
"At least a postcard,"
Mr. Allison said as she left. The Allisons owned a wall phone, and in order to get the operator, Mrs. Allison had first to turn the side crank and ring once. Usually it took 2 or 3 tries to force the operator to answer, and she approached the phone with resignation and sort of a desperate patience. She had to crank the phone 3 times this morning before the operator answered, and then it was still longer before Mr. Babcock picked up his phone in the grocery behind the meat table. "This is Mrs. Allison. I thought I'd order a day early because I want—"
"What's that, Mrs. Allison?"
Mrs. Allison raised her voice a little. She saw Mr. Allison out on the lawn turn in his chair and regard her sympathetically. "I said, Mr. Babcock, I thought that I'd order early so you could send me—"
"Mrs. Allison?" Mr. Babcock said. "You'll come and pick it up?"
"Pick it up?" In her surprise, she let her voice drop back to its normal tone. "I thought you'd send it out as usual," Mrs. Allison said.
"Well, Mrs. Allison," Mr. Babcock said, and there was a pause while Mrs. Allison waited, staring past the phone over her husband's head out to the sky. "My boy went back to school yesterday, and I got no one to deliver."
"I thought you always delivered," Mrs. Allison said.
"Not after Labor Day, Mrs. Allison,"
Mr. Babcock said, firmly. "Well," Mrs. Allison said helplessly. "Are you sure?" she asked finally. "Couldn't you just send out an order today, Mr. Babcock? What about Mr. Hall?"
"Hall?" Mr. Babcock said. "John Hall?"
"The people who live only 3 miles away from us," Mrs. Allison blurted. "Mr. Hall could bring it out when he comes."
"Well, the Halls have left, Mrs. Allison. They've gone to visit their folks upstate."
"But they bring all of our butter and eggs," Mrs. Allison said, appalled.
"Left yesterday," Babcock said. "Probably didn't know that you were staying on."
"But I told Mr. Hall," Mrs. Allison started to say and then stopped. "I'll send Mr. Allison tomorrow," she said. After she hung up, Mrs. Allison went slowly out to her chair next to her husband. "He won't deliver," she said. "You'll have to go in tomorrow. We've got just enough kerosene to last till you get back."
"Should have told us sooner,"
Mr. Allison said. The next morning, Mr. Allison, armed with a list, with kerosene in large letters at the top, went down the path to the garage, and Mrs. Allison began another pie in her baking dishes. She had mixed the crust and was starting to pare the apples when Mr. Allison flung open the door into the kitchen.
"Damn car won't start," he announced.
"Well, what's wrong with it?" Mrs. Allison demanded, stopping with the paring knife in one hand and an apple in the other. "It was all right on Tuesday."
"Well," Mr. Allison said between his teeth, "it's not all right on Friday."
"Can you fix it?" Mrs. Allison asked.
"No,"
Mr. Allison said.
"Gotta call the man who runs the filling station, I guess. He fixed it last summer one time."
A little apprehensive, Mrs. Allison went on paring apples absent-mindedly. While she listened to Mr. Allison with the phone ringing, waiting, finally giving the number to the operator, then waiting again and giving the number again, giving the number a third time, and then slamming down the receiver.
"No one there," he announced as he came into the kitchen.
"He's there alone, I imagine, so if he goes out, there's no one to answer the phone," Mrs. Allison said, nervously.
"That must be it,"
Mr. Allison said as he slumped into one of the kitchen chairs. "Well, why don't you go for the mail and then try him again?" Mr. Allison debated and then said,
"Guess I might as well."
He rose heavily and then got to the kitchen door and turned and said,
"But if there's no mail..."
And leaving an awful silence behind him, he went off down the path. Mrs. Allison hurried with her pie. The room seemed unexpectedly dark, and she felt the tension that precedes a thunderstorm. But both times when she looked to the sky, it was clear and serene. When Mrs. Allison, her pie ready for the oven, went a third time to look outside, she saw her husband coming up the path. He seemed more cheerful, and when he saw her, he waved eagerly and held a letter in the air.
"From Jerry," he called. "At last, a letter."
Mrs. Allison noticed with concern that he was no longer able to get up the path without breathing heavily, but then he was in the doorway holding out a letter.
"I saved it till I got here," he said.
Mrs. Allison could not imagine why the letter excited her so, except that it was the first that they had received in so long. It would be full of doings of Alice and the children, the recent weather in Chicago, and the progress of his job, closing with love for all. Mr. Allison slit the letter open with great deliberation and spread it out on the kitchen table where they leaned down to read it together.
"Dear Mother and Dad," it began,
in Jerry's familiar, childish handwriting.
"Am glad this goes to the lake as usual. We always thought that you came back too soon and ought to stay up there as long as you could. Alice says that now that you have no demands on your time, you ought to get what fun you can while you can. Since you two are both so happy up there, it's a good idea for you to stay."
Uneasily, Mrs. Allison glanced sideways at her husband, who was reading intently, and she reached out and picked up the empty envelope, not knowing exactly what she wanted from it. It was addressed as usual in Jerry's handwriting and postmarked Chicago. And she looked back down at the letter her husband had turned the page, and she read on with him. "And, of course, if they get measles, etc., now, they will be better off later. Alice and myself are well, of course. Been playing a lot of bridge lately with a nice young couple, about our age. Tell Dad old Dixon in our Chicago office died. He used to ask about Dad a lot. Have a good time up in the lake and don't bother about hurrying back. Love from all of us. Jerry."
"Funny," Mr. Allison commented. "Doesn't sound like Jerry."
Mrs. Allison said in a small voice, "He never wrote anything like..." She stopped.
"Like what?"
Mr. Allison demanded. Mrs. Allison turned the letter over, frowning. It was impossible to find any sentence, any word even, that did not sound like Jerry's regular letters. Perhaps it was only that the letter was so late, or the number of dirty prints on the envelope. "I don't know," she said impatiently. Mr. Allison tried the phone call again as Mrs. Allison read the letter twice more in search of a phrase that sounded wrong. And then,
Mr. Allison came back and said very quietly, "Phone's dead." The rest of the day went quickly. After a lunch of crackers and milk, the Allisons went to sit on the lawn, but their afternoon was cut short by storm clouds that came over the lake. In the evening, Mr. and Mrs. Allison, sitting close together inside their cottage, turned on the battery radio they had brought with them from New York. The only light came from the lightning outside and the small square glow from the dial of the radio. During one pause between commercials, Mrs. Allison turned and smiled weakly at her husband. I wonder if we're supposed to do anything," she said. "No," Mr. Allison said, considering. "I don't think so. Just wait." Mrs. Allison caught her breath quickly, and Mr. Allison said, "The car had been tampered with, you know. Even I could see that." Mrs. Allison hesitated a minute and then said very softly, "I suppose the phone wires were cut." "I knew when I saw the lights on at the Hall place last night," Mr. Allison said. After a while, the music stopped, and they listened attentively to the news broadcast. The announcer's rich voice telling of a Hollywood marriage and the latest baseball scores, quite as though they still deserved to hear of the world that no longer reached them except through the batteries on the radio, already beginning to fade. Mrs. Allison glanced out of the window at the waiting storm and said conversationally, "I feel better about that letter of Jerry's." The wind, coming up suddenly over the lake, swept around the summer cottage and slapped hard at the windows. Mr. and Mrs. Allison moved closer together, and with the first sudden crash of thunder, Mr. Allison took his wife's hand. And then, while the lightning flashed outside and the radio faded and sputtered, the two old people huddled together in their summer cottage and waited.